No one tells you that growth can feel like loss, that becoming more of yourself can quietly pull you away from the people who once felt like home. Not with arguments, not with drama, but with silence, distance, and a guilt you don't know what to do with. There's a kind of pain that rarely gets named. It doesn't crash into your life. It doesn't demand attention. It arrives slowly, almost gently. One day, you look around and realize that the people who once felt like your safe place now feel familiar, but far away. Not because something went wrong, not because of betrayal or conflict, but because something inside you shifted. And the hardest part is this: you didn't leave anyone intentionally. You just kept growing. Outgrowing people doesn't feel like success. It feels like disloyalty, even when no one accuses you, even when growth is supposed to be celebrated. Everyone talks about leveling up, about becoming more, about moving forward, but no one really talks about the guilt that comes from evolving while others stay the same. At first, the change is barely noticeable. You sense that conversations repeat themselves. The humor doesn't hit the same. The things that excite you are met with short responses, polite smiles, or quick topic changes. So you begin to edit yourself. You soften your words. You downplay your progress. Not because you think you're better, but because you don't want to create discomfort. And that's where the guilt begins. You start wondering, am I changing too much? Am I becoming someone they don't recognize? Am I leaving people behind just by moving forward? Here's a truth most people never say out loud. Outgrowing others doesn't mean you think you're superior. It means you're no longer the same version of yourself that fits seamlessly into the old dynamic. And dynamics don't collapse dramatically, they fade. You once bonded over the same fears, the same struggles, the same frustrations. Now you're solving problems they're still living inside. You're asking questions they avoid. You're choosing discomfort in ways they're not ready for. Suddenly, you feel out of place, not because you did something wrong, but because you changed. And somehow, you start feeling responsible. Responsible for the distance, responsible for the silence, responsible for the shift. But growth doesn't ask permission. It just happens. Still, the guilt lingers, because growth brings awareness. You start seeing patterns you once tolerated, emotional cycles you used to excuse, behaviors you once normalized but can no longer ignore. That awareness creates separation, not physically at first, but emotionally. You're still present, still in the same room, but no longer standing in the same place. And the painful part is this: you miss them. You miss who they were to you. You miss who you were with them. You miss the version of yourself that didn't overthink every interaction, that didn't feel guilty for dreaming bigger, that didn't associate growth with loss. Because here's the uncomfortable reality: growth always costs something. Sometimes it costs comfort, sometimes it costs certainty, and sometimes it costs people. But society romanticizes growth. It shows the confidence, the success, the glow. It rarely shows the quiet nights where you wonder if you changed too much to belong anywhere. You start asking yourself, why do I feel lonely even though I'm doing better? Why does wanting more come with guilt? Why does progress sometimes feel heavier than failure? The answer isn't ingratitude. It's that growth separates before it connects. When you outgrow others, you enter an in-between space. You're no longer who you were, but you're not yet surrounded by people who reflect who you're becoming. So you float, and floating feels lonely. You don't fit into old conversations, but you don't yet feel rooted in new ones. And because you're empathetic, because you care, because you remember where you came from, the guilt follows you, even when the distance wasn't intentional. But here's something important you need to hear. Outgrowing others is not cruelty. It's the result of self-respect. When you start choosing honesty over comfort, growth over familiarity, awareness over avoidance, some relationships simply can't keep up, not because the people are bad, but because the relationship was built for a version of you that no longer exists. And that realization hurts, because you never wanted to hurt anyone. You didn't wake up and decide to walk away. You just stopped abandoning yourself, and that changed everything. This guilt feels heavy for a reason. Humans are wired for belonging. For most of history, being disconnected wasn't emotional. It was dangerous. So when growth threatens connection, your nervous system interprets it as loss. Even if your mind understands the evolution, your body feels unsafe. That's why you second-guess yourself. Why do you consider slowing down? Why do you sometimes think about shrinking back just to keep the peace? But peace that requires self-betrayal isn't peace, it's delay. And eventually, the cost becomes too high. You start feeling drained by conversations that once energized you, misunderstood even when you're heard, tired of explaining yourself or not explaining at all. And that's when guilt turns into grief. Because you're not just losing people, you're grieving futures that will never happen, plans that once felt certain, inside jokes that no longer land, dreams that no longer align. It's invisible grief, the hardest kind, especially when nothing bad happened. No explosion, no betrayal, just evolution. And still, the guilt whispers, shouldn't I stay loyal? Shouldn't I be grateful? Shouldn't I try harder to keep things the same? But here's the truth. Most people learn too late. Staying the same for others eventually becomes resentment. And resentment slowly dissolves love. You show up less, listen less, care less. Not because you stopped caring, but because you're exhausted from being somewhere you've already outgrown. And that version of you deserves honesty. Growth doesn't erase your past. It honors it without letting it trap you. Some people will feel left behind, not because you abandoned them, but because they chose familiarity over transformation. That doesn't make them wrong. It just means your paths diverged. The guilt you feel isn't proof that you're doing something wrong. It's proof. It means you cared deeply. It means you didn't discard people casually. But caring doesn't mean staying stuck. Here's something rarely acknowledged. Sometimes people don't miss you. They miss access to the version of you that made them comfortable. The predictable version, the unchallenging version, the version that didn't disrupt the dynamic. When that version disappears, discomfort follows. But discomfort isn't harm, it's an invitation. Some people rise to it, some don't, and that's not your responsibility. The guilt of outgrowing others often comes from the belief that your growth invalidates theirs. It doesn't. Growth isn't competition. Your evolution doesn't erase anyone's worth. It simply reveals alignment, or the lack of it. And alignment matters more than history. History alone cannot sustain connection. Only shared direction can. You can love people deeply and still accept that they can't walk where you're going. You can cherish memories without forcing a future that no longer fits. You can feel guilt without letting it control your life. Because shrinking to keep others comfortable doesn't save relationships. It quietly erases you. And losing yourself is a far greater loss. In the next part, we'll talk about how to hold this guilt without becoming cold, how to grow without isolating yourself, how to let go without turning evolution into loneliness. Because outgrowing others isn't the end of connection. It's the beginning of a more honest one, starting with yourself. And here's what no one really prepares you for. The guilt doesn't vanish overnight. It changes. At first, it's loud, questioning, restless. Later, it becomes quiet. It shows up when you're doing well and think of someone who isn't there anymore. When you laugh at something new and realize the old circle wouldn't understand. When you want to share a win and stop yourself, not out of shame, but out of care. This is the guilt of growth, not because growth is wrong, but because it redraws the emotional map of your life. The most confusing part, no one is at fault. Nothing broke, things shifted. And humans struggle more with shifts than endings. Endings are clear, shifts are ambiguous. When something fades slowly, your heart keeps trying to revive it. You replay moments, question yourself, wonder if you're distant or just different. That internal conflict is exhausting. So many people get stuck here, trying to carry two versions of themselves at once. They show up halfway, speak cautiously, avoid what matters to them, pretend they haven't changed, and eventually that split costs them peace, because authenticity isn't optional. You can't hide growth forever. Something always gives, and often it's your sense of calm. Outgrowing others doesn't mean you stop loving them. It means the way you love them must evolve. Love doesn't always mean closeness. Sometimes love is acceptance without attachment, and that's one of the hardest forms of love there is. Attachment feels like loyalty, like proof, like safety. But it can also quietly demand that you stay small, not intentionally, but because comfort resists disruption. Growth disrupts simply by being honest. Some people lean in. They ask questions. They evolve with you. Others pull away silently, not from malice, but because growth challenges familiarity. So the guilt isn't about harm. It's about truth. Not everyone who started with you can come with you, and that realization can feel lonely, but perspective matters. Think of how many versions of yourself you've already outgrown. You don't feel guilty for that. You feel grateful, because growth always leaves something behind. Relationships are no different. They're living systems. They adapt, or they remain tied to a moment in time. Outgrowing others doesn't make you superior. It means your inner world expanded. You became more aware, more aligned, more honest. That expansion created a gap, and guilt tries to fill it with responsibility. But you are not responsible for managing everyone else's comfort. You are responsible for living truthfully, and truth doesn't require cruelty, only clarity. Clarity says, I care about you, even if we don't connect the same way anymore. You don't even have to say it out loud. You can live it quietly by letting go of over-explaining, by releasing the need to be understood by everyone, by allowing relationships to find their natural distance. This is where guilt softens. Not because you stop caring, but because you stop blaming yourself for change. You didn't grow overnight. They didn't lose you suddenly. You evolved. They stayed where they were. Both can exist without either being wrong. What hurts most isn't growth. It's the belief that growth must equal loss. Sometimes it means transformation. Sometimes it means quieter connections. Sometimes it means distance that isn't permanent. But forcing closeness will always breed resentment. So ask yourself this: am I honoring my growth or apologizing for it? Because growth doesn't need permission, and you don't owe stagnation to anyone. There's another layer to this guilt, a fear of ending up alone. When familiar bonds fade, uncertainty appears. The guilt whispers, maybe going back is safer. But safety without alignment slowly erodes you. You show up, but you're not present. You speak, but you filter. You smile, but something feels wrong. Loneliness can be temporary. Self-abandonment lasts longer. Growth asks for courage, not just to change, but to sit with the space change creates. That space is where new belonging forms, if you don't rush to fill it with the past. The guilt of outgrowing others isn't something to erase, it's something to understand. It's empathy colliding with evolution, and that's not weakness, that's depth. So instead of asking, how do I stop feeling guilty? Ask this: how do I grow with compassion without shrinking myself? That balance is maturity, honoring what was without clinging, caring without carrying, loving without losing yourself. Outgrowing others isn't a failure of loyalty. It's a sign your inner world is expanding. And while that expansion can feel isolating, it also leads to a deeper sense of alignment with people who see you as you are now, with conversations that stretch you, with connections that don't require explanation. So if you're carrying guilt, let this settle gently. You didn't become distant to hurt anyone. You became honest with yourself, and that honesty deserves space. Growth will always change who walks beside you, but it will bring you closer to who you are. And that is not something to feel guilty about. It's something to respect.